Hey, you found us.
Welcome, everybody.
This is Scripture Gems. Hello and welcome to the show. My name is John Fullmer, and this is my brother Jay.
How's it going, John?
We are two brothers who just can't get enough of the Scriptures.
Yeah, we love them.
This episode, we are going over the Come Follow Me lesson for June 6th through 12th, 2022. This is covering the book of Ruth and 1 Samuel, chapters 1 through 3. And now let's bring out the star of the show, the Scriptures.
Hello, Scriptures.
Hey, Scriptures. Looking great. And now let's consult the Scripturematic 6000 to find out how long it will take to read this week's reading. 32 minutes, 55 seconds.
Well, this is great because we're back to some of those manageable reading times we've had in weeks past. But what would it be daily?
4 minutes, 42 seconds.
Exactly. So easy. Here we've got time codes if you want to take this chapter by chapter. You might notice this time we're not skipping any chapters. Come Follow Me is covering all of them, and of course we will too. Let's begin with an introduction to the book of Ruth. The story of Ruth occurred during the time of the Judges, which we find out in the first 2 verses of Ruth, though it may have been written long after. One indication is the genealogy of King David included at the end of the book. We will find that Ruth is an important part of that genealogy. Also, in this story, we will meet a man named Boaz, whose mother we have already met. Remember when Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho?
Jericho?
Jericho. When Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Rahab, a Canaanite, was preserved and married a good Jewish boy, Salmon, and their son is Boaz.
The seminary manual tells us the book of Ruth seems to provide valuable balance by reminding its readers that the great-grandmother of the revered King David was a faithful woman from Moab, a foreigner, who converted to Israel's religion and married within the covenant. Ruth demonstrated kindness to others and loyalty to the Lord. One of the main messages of the book of Ruth is that such faithfulness is more important than ethnicity. To put it another way, who you are as a child of God is more important than where and in what circumstances you were born.
Great point. So as we start Ruth chapter 1, there are some names to know. Elimelech, the father of the family. His name means, "My God is king." Check footnote 2a. Naomi, his wife. Her name means pleasant. You can see that in footnote 20a. Mahlon and Chilion, their sons. Orpah and Ruth, women of Moab, foreigners and wives to the sons.
And one quick note of celebrity trivia. Famous talk show host Oprah Winfrey has mentioned in interviews that she is actually named after Orpah. This is the name on her birth certificate. While growing up, most of the people around her mispronounced it, and Oprah stuck with her.
That's interesting. So in the first 5 verses, it talks about that in the days of the Judges, a famine in the land caused Elimelech to leave his home in Bethlehem and sojourn eastward across the Jordan River in the land of Moab. Now, verse 2 calls the family Ephrathites of Bethlehem. If you look at the footnote B for verse 2, it takes you to Genesis 35:19, but you can also see information in Ruth chapter 4, verse 11, that Bethlehem and Ephrath are 2 different names for the same place. Note also in the Bible dictionary, there's an entry for Ephrath that will give you similar information. While in Moab, Elimelech dies, and his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, married local women of Moab, Orpah and Ruth, and after about 10 years, the sons of Naomi died, and now she was left alone with her daughters-in-law.
So let's pick up the story in verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how that the Lord had visited his people in giving them bread. Wherefore she went forth out of the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah.
This is kind of interesting. The telling of the story really plays on the ideas of the meanings of some of the names. For example, in verse 6, when it says that she found that the Lord had visited the people and giving them bread in her homeland, which she's returning to. But where's her homeland? Well, we know at the beginning of the chapter, they came from Bethlehem. And Bethlehem means house of bread. And so now the Lord has filled the house of bread, and she's returning to that place, Bethlehem.
Hebrew wordplay. Gotta love it.
It's interesting.
Going on in verse 8, And Naomi said unto her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as ye have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that ye may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept.
Can you imagine how hard that must have been for Naomi to do that? One of the features we'll see in this story is a rich, loving kindness. This is captured in the Hebrew word chesed. It refers to a benevolence beyond what is expected or anticipated. Look how we see chesed in the verses we just read. Naomi is going to return home to her people. Orpah and Ruth plan to leave their homeland and go with her. Chesed. Naomi is alone, and I'm certain craves for the daughters-in-law she loves to be with her. But she sends them back to their family homes with the Lord's blessings for the kindness they have shown her. She wants what's best for them, even if it means that she will have no one. Again, chesed. Orpah and Ruth have good reason to agree with Naomi's wishes. They have more prospects in the land of their nativity, where they know the culture and the people, where they have family and resources. But look at how they respond in verse 10. And they said unto her, Surely we will return with thee unto thy people. Again, chesed. But as much as it breaks her heart, Naomi reminds them in verses 11 through 14 that she has nothing to give them. She has no husbands to bless them with. Orpah finally and tearfully follows Naomi's counsel and returns to her family. But in verse 14 we read, Ruth clave unto her. Chesed, benevolence beyond expectation.
And in fact, we have these famous verses, starting with Naomi speaking in verse 15. And she said, Behold, thy sister-in-law is gone back unto her people and unto her gods. Return thou after thy sister-in-law. And Ruth said, Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go, and whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me.
Wow! What a powerful expression of love and faith. Ruth has no reason to think that things could work out for her by making this choice, but she will not leave Naomi, and she will not abandon the God of Israel.
And that's certainly a much better choice than her people's God. The Moabites worshipped Chemosh, which, among other atrocities, required sacrifice of human children. I suppose that she was greatly affected by her time with her husband and Elimelech's family to appreciate the true God when she found him.
Oh yeah, good point.
In the next few verses, Naomi and Ruth traveled to Bethlehem, and since they were extremely poor, they desperately needed to find a way to support themselves. There's an interesting wordplay in verse 20 that's kind of lost in English. In the previous verse, when the people of Bethlehem recognize Naomi, is this Naomi? Naomi has a clever response in verse 20. And she said unto them, Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Naomi is a Hebrew name that means pleasant. Mara is a Hebrew word that means bitter. You can check footnote 20b. But you also might remember back when we studied Exodus chapter 15, when the children of Israel had just crossed the Red Sea and spent 3 days in the wilderness of Shur, they finally found water, but it was too bitter to drink. and they called the place Mara. So Naomi is actually saying, don't call me pleasant, call me bitter, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me.
Yeah, it's an important distinction to make, that she's asking them to call her bitter not because she is bitter, but because bitter things have happened to her. So moving on to Ruth chapter 2, let's start with verse 1. And Naomi had a kinsman of her husband's, a mighty man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, and his name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabitess said unto Naomi, Let me now go to the field, and glean ears of corn after him, in whose sight I shall find grace. And she said unto her, Go, my daughter. And she went and came, and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And her hap was to light on a part of the field belonging unto Boaz, who was of the kindred of Elimelech.
Now you may remember that the Lord gave instructions in the law of Moses that those who owned fields should not harvest the crops in the edges of their fields. The law allowed the poor to harvest these crops, ensuring that they would have something to eat. In fact, often harvesters wouldn't even bother to pick up dropped stalks while bundling them into sheaves. These too were left for the poor. After the harvest was gathered in, the poor were also allowed to go into the field and glean the crops that had been missed by the harvesters. You can find out more information about this by reading Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22, and also don't forget to check your Institute manual. Lots of good stuff in there.
Right.
But let's go on with the story in verse 5. Then said Boaz unto his servants that was set over the reapers, Whose damsel is this? And the servant that was set over the reapers answered and said, It is the Moabitish damsel that came back with Naomi out of the country of Moab. And she said, I pray you, let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves. So she came, and hath continued even from the morning until now, that she tarried a little in the house.
Do you wonder why Boaz inquired about her? Was it because she was a foreigner? Maybe, but maybe he also saw something about her in the way that she worked or conducted herself. Maybe the Spirit of the Lord prompted him to notice her. Going on in verse 8, Then said Boaz unto Ruth, Hearest thou not, my daughter? Go not to glean in another field, neither go from hence, but abide here fast by my maidens. Let thine eyes be on the field that they do reap, and go thou after them. Have I not charged the young men that they shall not touch thee? And when thou art athirst, go unto the vessels, and drink of that which the young men have drawn. Now look at how Boaz treats her, with benevolence beyond expectation or anticipation. Remember that word? Chesed. In verse 10, Then she fell on her face, and bowed herself to the ground, and said unto him, Why have I found grace in thine eyes, that thou shouldst take knowledge of me, seeing I am a stranger? Ruth recognizes and is grateful for Boaz's generosity.
Going on in verse 11, And Boaz answered and said unto her, It hath fully been showed me all that thou hast done unto thy mother-in-law since the death of thine husband, and how thou hast left thy father and thy mother, and the land of thy nativity, and art come unto a people which thou knowest not heretofore. The Lord recompense thy work, and a full reward be given thee of the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings thou art come to trust.
You know, after the challenging situations we've been reading about, how great is it to bask in genuinely good people, letting God's light shine through them?
I wonder if Boaz was particularly diligent about showing Ruth the goodness of living in the land of Israel and worshiping the true God, because he knew she was a foreigner. Sometimes we have a tendency to believe that the Jews were very exclusive. Perhaps some were, but throughout the Old Testament, and even in what we are reading now, outside converts to the faith of Israel were common.
It's true, and the idea that they are very exclusive is something that really becomes part of their history after the exile and the return to Jerusalem. We see that a lot in those writings. But for now, these doors are wide open. Have you ever felt the Lord's blessings in your life because you had shown love or kindness to another person? In Ruth chapter 2, verses 13 to 23, Boaz showed additional kindness to Ruth by inviting her to eat with him and the reapers, the people he hired to harvest his fields. Boaz also told the reapers to leave extra portions of grain for Ruth to harvest. In verse 14, it says that he reached her parched corn. This is roasted corn. And she did eat and was sufficed and left. Going on in verse 15. And when she had risen up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, "Let her glean among the sheaves." Now, the sheaves, that's the grain that was already gathered. And then he gives them this additional instruction. "And reproach her not, and let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her." That means on purpose. "And leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not." So she gleaned in the field until even, and beat out that she had gleaned, meaning to thresh, or separating the grain from the stalks. And it was about an ephah of barley. And she took it up, and went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned, and she brought forth, and gave to her that she had reserved after she was sufficed. This is indicating that she brought leftovers from the meal that Boaz had given her, that parched corn, and she'd saved it for Naomi. Again, chesed. What great love and benevolence. Now, in the coming verses, Naomi was amazed at what Ruth had brought home. So much barley and leftovers from the meal besides. Ruth told her what had happened. Together they rejoiced in the Lord's blessings and kindness to them. Ruth remained with Boaz's fields until the end of harvest.
Also in verse 20, Naomi makes an important observation. The man, Boaz, is near of kin unto us, one of our next kinsmen. Take a look at footnote 20b, the footnote for next kinsman. It says, redeemers, one of those having the right to redeem.
Have you been able to notice that quality of a redeemer in what Boaz was doing, how he behaved toward her, how he loved her because of who she was and how he treated her, how he told others to try to make life a little easier for her, dropping extra things, helping her to be blessed with more than what she would otherwise have? Have we ever felt that kind of thing from our Redeemer? It's a really interesting parallel.
This is a very important observation for the rest of the book as well. Let's see how. Going on to Ruth chapter 3. Now, Naomi may not have had any more sons to give her daughter-in-law, but that doesn't mean she can't help Ruth get a husband. Let's look at verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said unto her, My daughter, shall I not seek rest for thee, that it may be well with thee? Take a look at footnote A. The word rest implies marriage. Verse 2. And now is not Boaz of our kindred, with whose maidens thou wast? Behold, he winnoweth barley tonight in the threshing floor. Now, to winnow is to take a type of pitchfork or winnowing fork and throw the threshed or beaten stalks up and let the wind separate the grain and the rest of the plant. So why does Naomi think that Ruth could marry Boaz? Under the customs and cultural laws of the Israelites, if a husband dies childless, it was the duty of the husband's brother or nearest male relative to marry the widow and raise up children to the dead man's name. You can find more information about that in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, and also check the Bible dictionary for levirate marriage. Naomi pointed out that Boaz is a kindred of her late husband Elimelech, a redeemer.
Interesting. It's interesting, too, that even though he is a redeemer in the story, it takes some initiative to access that. Let's take a look in verse 3. Naomi continues her instructions. Wash thyself, therefore, and anoint thee, and put thy raiment upon thee, and get thee down to the floor. But make not thyself known unto the man, until he shall have done eating and drinking. And it shall be, when he lieth down, that thou shalt mark the place where he shall lie, and thou shalt go in, and uncover his feet, and lay thee down, and he will tell thee what thou shalt do. And she said unto her, All that thou sayest unto me, I will do. Now, scholars have puzzled over what Ruth is being instructed to do. Naomi seems to be familiar with the intention of this action, but she doesn't explain it further. Although feet is often a Hebrew euphemism for genitals, as we saw in the story of Eglon in Judges chapter 2, it's also used again for that same purpose in Isaiah 7 verse 20. But there's no evidence of anything immoral going on here, and it would be out of place in the story. The moral integrity of Naomi and Ruth is never in doubt, which is emphasized in verse 11. Both Boaz and Ruth are cautious for her reputation.
From the seminary manual, we read, Ruth's uncovering of Boaz's feet was a sign of submission and an action signaling that she wanted him to be her protector and husband. So Ruth carries out Naomi's plan, and at midnight, Boaz awakes to find Ruth lying at his feet. In verse 9, and he said, Who art thou? And she answered, I am Ruth, thine handmaid. Spread therefore thy skirt over thine handmaid, for thou art a near kinsman.
Hey, this wasn't the instructions. Naomi told her that Boaz would tell her what to do. I think her initiative here says a lot about her character.
In verse 10, and he said, Blessed be thou of the Lord, my daughter, for thou hast showed more kindness in the latter end than at the beginning, inasmuch as thou followest not young men, whether poor or rich.
That's kind of another way of describing chesed. Boaz considers her benevolence to him beyond expectation or anticipation, but also to Naomi. Boaz seems to think that Ruth could have her pick of young men, but if she did, Elimelech's line would have ended. By marrying in the family, she will raise up seed to Elimelech and Naomi.
And in verse 11, And now, my daughter, fear not. I will do to thee all that thou requirest, for all the city of my people doth know that thou art a virtuous woman.
Amen. There's a wonderful quote from the October 2008 General Conference from Sister Elaine S. Dalton. She talks about virtue this way. Virtue is a pattern of thought and behavior based on high moral standards. It encompasses chastity and moral purity. Virtue begins in the heart and in the mind. It is nurtured in the home. It is the accumulation of thousands of small decisions and actions. Virtue is a word we don't hear often in today's society, but the Latin root word, virtus, means strength. Virtuous women and men possess a quiet dignity and inner strength. Let's go on in verse 12. And now it is true that I am thy near kinsman. Howbeit, there is a kinsman nearer than I. Tarry this night, and it shall be in the morning, that if he will perform unto thee the part of a kinsman, well, let him do the kinsman's part. But if he will not do the part of a kinsman to thee, then will I do the part of a kinsman to thee, as the Lord liveth. Lie down until the morning. Boaz, honorable, kind, a leader, trustworthy. What a guy! So in verses 14 through 18, Ruth stayed near Boaz until the early morning, and then Boaz sent her home with a gift of grain for herself and Naomi. Of course he did.
And that brings us to Ruth chapter 4. In the first couple of verses, Boaz met the nearest kinsman at the gate of the city where legal agreements were made. He employed 10 elders of the city as witnesses. Boaz knew that according to the custom and levirate marriage rules for their day, the nearest male relative of a deceased man could marry his widow and receive all of his property. The kinsman mentioned in Ruth 4 was the nearest living relative to Mahlon, Ruth's deceased husband. You can see that in verse 10. There's kind of a funny phrasing in verse 1. We read, And behold, the kinsman of whom Boaz spake came by, unto whom he said, Ho, such a one! Turn aside, sit down here. Take a look at footnote 1c on the phrase, Ho, such a one. It reads, in Hebrew, a manner of address to a certain unnamed person, as Mr. So-and-so. We might translate it today as, Hey, you guys, take a seat.
Yeah.
Going on in verse 3. Naomi, that is come again out of the country of Moab, selleth a parcel of land, which was our brother Elimelech's. And I thought to advertise thee, saying, Buy it before the inhabitants, and before the elders of my people. If thou wilt redeem it, redeem it. But if thou wilt not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know. For there is none to redeem it besides thee, and I am after thee. And he said, I will redeem it. Then said Boaz, What day thou buyest the field of the hand of Naomi, thou must buy it also of Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance. And the kinsman said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I mar mine own inheritance. Redeem thou my right to thyself, for I cannot redeem it.
Interesting. That was a very interesting approach that Boaz took to set this up. I'm sure it was all above board, but it's interesting to watch it happen. In the next couple of verses, the kinsman gave his shoe to Boaz, signifying that he would not or could not fulfill his obligation to raise up children to his relative. You can learn about that in Deuteronomy 25, verses 8 through 10. So going on in verse 9, And Boaz said unto the elders and unto all the people, Ye are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's, and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's of the hand of Naomi. Moreover, Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, have I purchased to be my wife, to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren, and from the gate of his place. Ye are witnesses this day. Now, it might sound a little bit strange to say that he purchased Ruth to be his wife, but to redeem means to pay the price owed. So when we talk about a slave, for example, being redeemed, it's paying the price to make the slave free. So this isn't a purchase. This is a way of describing how Boaz is taking on the debt and the responsibility of Elimelech's family to himself for Elimelech. Boaz becomes a redeemer to Naomi's family, a benevolence beyond anticipation, chesed.
The seminary manual tells us one prominent theme in the book of Ruth is that of redemption, which applies to all of us. Ruth was a foreigner, childless, and a widow, which left her in complete poverty with no source of support. Nevertheless, Ruth faithfully accepted the gospel and joined the Lord's covenant people. Though she could not deliver herself from her destitute condition, she was ultimately redeemed by her kinsman Boaz, a man of Bethlehem. Because of Ruth's faith-driven actions and the kindness of her Redeemer, Ruth married again, was fully accepted as an Israelite, became a woman of some wealth, and was blessed with children. Like Ruth, we cannot save ourselves but must rely on a Redeemer from Bethlehem, one who is able to lift us from our fallen state and secure our happiness as part of his family. Given this theme of redemption, it is interesting to note that Jesus Christ, the Redeemer of Israel and of all mankind, was one of Ruth's descendants.
I love that. We can see that in the genealogy described in Matthew chapter 1. So, what can we learn from Ruth about what we need to do to be redeemed? She stayed true to God, to her family. She served out of love and was benevolent beyond what was asked for. She was obedient, faithful, virtuous, willing to take initiative in seeking blessings and making covenants. In verses 15 through 17, when the Lord blessed Ruth with a son, the women cheered Naomi and said that her daughter-in-law Ruth, who loved her, was better than 7 sons, as it says in verse 14. But look for this last tender moment of benevolence from Ruth to Naomi. In verse 16, And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became nurse unto it. I really like the translation from the New Living Translation of the Bible, which crafts the verse this way. Naomi took the baby and cuddled him to her breast, and she cared for him as if he were her own. Now imagine this. Ruth has never had children after 10 years with her first husband. You could imagine her clinging to her new baby, basking in motherhood. But she makes room for Grandma Naomi. Lots of room. In verse 17 it says, And the women, her neighbors, gave it a name, saying, There is a son born to Naomi. and they called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. Isn't that interesting that it was the neighbors that gave the child the name, and how they described that it was kind of like Naomi spent so much time with this little baby that people referred to it as Naomi's child. I think that is one of the great acts of benevolence from Ruth to Naomi. What a blessing. So at the start of Ruth's story, we shared some of the names and what they meant. The meaning of names are sometimes used as part of the telling of stories for the Israelites. Sometimes we can see how the author crafted the telling of the story by replacing the names with the meanings as they would have been understood by their Jewish readers. So let's do that. Let's look at the names again. Elimelech, my God is king. Naomi, pleasant one. Mahlon and Chilion we didn't talk about. Their names mean disease and destruction, respectively. Orpah means back of the neck. It sounds kind of like an insult, but you'll understand why they use that name as we get to the story. And Ruth means dewy, which is kind of a strange one for us, but imagine if you're living in a very arid environment and you wake up in the morning and dew is covering the plants. That's just like a promise of God's blessings. So think about that when you think of dewy. Now, Naomi also has another name we talked about, Mara, meaning bitter woman. And then we have Boaz, he who has might. Tikva Frymer-Kensky, in her book Reading the Women of the Bible, includes a summary narrative where she did just what we're talking about, replaced the names with the meanings of the names. Here's how it might read. Once, many years ago, famine drove My God is King and Pleasant One from Bethlehem in the land of Judah to the land of Moab. There, My God is King died. His 2 sons, Disease and Destruction, married local women, but after a while, they too died, leaving only Pleasant One and her 2 daughters-in-law. When they heard that there was food in Bethlehem, they set out to return. On the way, Pleasant One released her 2 daughters-in-law and sent them back to begin new lives. Back of the neck tearfully turned and left. But Dewy stayed with her mother-in-law. Now no longer Pleasant One, but bitter woman, for God had killed her men. In Bethlehem they turned to their kinsman, he who has might. First God, then Pleasant Woman, then Dewy, and then he who has might planned to bring them together. And finally, he who has might married Dewy. And from this union came he who serves, the grandfather of Beloved. And of course, beloved is the meaning of the name David.
Nice. So let's finish our study of Ruth with a quote from then Elder Thomas S. Monson from a talk he gave in the October 1974 General Conference called My Personal Hall of Fame. We found this in the Institute Manual. It says, quote, "In our selection of heroes, let us nominate also heroines. First, that noble example of fidelity, even Ruth, sensing the grief-stricken heart of her mother-in-law who suffered the loss of each of her 2 fine sons, and feeling perhaps the pangs of despair and loneliness which plagued the very soul of Naomi, Ruth uttered what has become that classic statement of loyalty, 'Entreat me not to leave thee, or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God.'" Ruth's actions demonstrated the sincerity of her words. There is place for her name in the Hall of Fame. End quote.
Love it. What a great story. Now, there is a continuation. So we mentioned that Ruth took place during the time of the Judges. So the book of Judges would include Ruth's story in that time period. But 1 Samuel is a continuation of Judges as well. The book of 1 Samuel recounts the ministry of the prophet Samuel, who restored law and order and regular religious worship in the land after the Israelites had forgotten the Lord and worshipped idols many times throughout the reign of the Judges. Although we don't know who the author or authors were, the information for the book drew from the writings found in the book of Samuel the seer and in the book of Nathan the prophet, and in the book of Gad the seer. That's from 1 Chronicles 29:29. 1 Samuel begins with the story of Hannah and her son Samuel, who would become the righteous priest, prophet, and the last of the judges of Israel. Chapters 8 through 15 focus on Saul, the first king of Israel, and chapters 16 through 31 describe the rise of David. One of the major themes in 1 Samuel is the importance of honoring the Lord. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30, we read, "Them that honor me, I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed." In other words, the Lord will bless those who honor him and keep his commandments, and those who do not will not receive his blessings. Watch for that theme as we begin with
1 Samuel chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Now there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of Mount Ephraim.
Now, did you notice, if you feel comfortable saying the word Ephraim, then Ramathaim Zophim, not so bad. Rama and then Thaim is very similar to Ephraim if you look at those last three letters. Again, don't let these pronunciations throw you off. Ramathaim Zophim. And again, you can always use your audio scriptures to figure that out. But inasmuch as you spend time learning to at least come up with a pronunciation for these, you'll just sound so cool in front of your friends.
Going back to the verse. And his name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. Now notice, like with the story of Ruth, our story starts with people from Bethlehem. Verse 2, And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. Now, quick side note, the New Oxford Annotated Bible notes that other indicates that Peninnah is the second wife. Elkanah may have married her because Hannah could not have children. Going on in verse 3, And this man went up out of his city yearly to worship and to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. Now Shiloh is the location of the tabernacle. As for Eli, we'll get to know him in just a little bit, and unfortunately, we will learn more about his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, in the next chapter.
Boo!
The NIV Study Bible notes, The festival referred to here was probably the Feast of the Tabernacles, which not only commemorated God's care for his people during the desert journey to Canaan, but more especially celebrated, with joy and feasting, God's blessings on the year's crops, the fruits of the land. On such festive occasions, Hannah's deep sorrow because of her own barrenness was the more poignant. Let's go on in verse 4. And when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters, portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of the Lord, so she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat.
Now that idea of a worthy portion in verse 5 means that he gave her more than would be expected, more than would be anticipated. So we're continuing these ideas of chesed in this story, but there might be some additional ways to see that. Let's examine a couple of things before we proceed. 1, who is antagonizing Hannah and making her cry? Readers traditionally blame Peninnah. She has kids and Hannah does not. The situation conjures up an image of Abraham's household when Hagar antagonizes Sarah because she could have kids and Sarah could not. But notice that the text doesn't say who her adversary is specifically. The writing here is surprisingly vague. Even the seminary manual only suggests that the antagonist is, quote, possibly, unquote, Peninnah. Our traditional understanding that Peninnah is a villain has never sat right with me. What's her motivation? She knows how much Elkanah loves Hannah, verse 5. Persecuting Hannah would just alienate Peninnah from her husband. She would know the story of Hagar and Sarah, and that didn't work out well for Hagar. I suppose she could just be a jerk and a self-destructive type of a person. Tikva-Frymer-Kensky offers another view that can be supported by the Hebrew in these verses. What the King James Version translated as, quote, her adversary also provoked her sore for to make her fret or cry. In verse 6, the Hebrew could be either so that she cried aloud, or she made her cry aloud. But if Peninnah was the adversary, what was her purpose in provoking her so that she cried aloud? Quoting from Tikva-Frymer-Kensky's book, Reading the Women of the Bible, a rabbinic midrash explains that Peninnah wanted to help Hannah. She made her angry so she would not accept childlessness as her fate and would cry aloud so that God would hear her affliction. If this was truly Peninnah's purpose, millennia of tradition owe her an apology. And the story has two more parallels to the story of Ruth. It, too, would have no villains, only people trying to be kind to one another. And the two births of Samuel and of Obed, the son of Ruth, would be the result of women showing solidarity with one another in ways that the society does not anticipate. If this was truly Peninnah's purpose, it worked. Hannah refused to eat from depression or fasting and prayed for a child. Now, it could be that Peninnah really is the antagonist and a rival to Hannah, or it could be that she's a supportive and loving friend, the kind that tells you what you need to hear even if you don't want to hear it. Another example of chesed. You'll have to decide which way reads best for you.
Well, let's go back to the chapter, starting in verse 8. Then said Elkanah her husband to her, Hannah, why weepest thou? And why eatest thou not? And why is thy heart grieved? Am I not better to thee than 10 sons?
Okay. Now, many women I know are not happy with Elkanah by what he says to Hannah here, feeling that he is blind to the struggle she is going through. May I offer another suggestion? Elkanah is awesome. He cannot give Hannah a child. He cannot fix the problem. He reassures her of his love, in that he gives her a portion for the sacrifice as if she had children. Tikva-Frymer-Kensky makes this observation, quote, since a childless woman could be in a precarious position if he died, he intimates that he is taking care of her, providing for her, as Ruth provided for Naomi, which the neighbors acclaimed, for she is better for you than 7 sons. Ruth chapter 4, verse 15, close quote. Elkanah cannot understand her situation, but I don't think he was wrong to try to help her see the blessings the Lord had given her. But we don't know if this helped Hannah or not, if she was offended or not. Whether or not Elkanah understood is not the issue. Hannah's true answer is in her actions. There is evidence that Elkanah's encouragement helped her. For one, she ate something.
Right, let's go in verse 9. So Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had drunk. Now Eli the priest sat on a seat by a post of the temple of the Lord. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed unto the Lord, and wept sore. And she vowed a vow, and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid, and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. And it came to pass, as she continued praying before the Lord, that Eli marked her mouth. Now Hannah, she spake in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore Eli thought she had been drunken. And Eli said unto her, How long wilt thou be drunken? Put away thy wine from thee. And Hannah answered and said, No, my lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Count not thine handmaid for a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. Now take a moment to check your footnote for Belial. Footnote B, worthlessness, good for nothing, base wickedness. Perhaps a daughter or son of Belial might be called an iniquitous sluggard, a lowlife, or a delinquent. It's a term we'll encounter throughout the Old Testament, but no book uses it more than Samuel.
No, that's true. By the way, if you're interested in knowing how the book of Samuel got broken into 1st and 2nd Samuel, check out our video on how we got the Bible. So, what impresses you about Hannah's prayer? I'm amazed that as much as she wants a child, she is willing to dedicate it to the Lord. That is not a give me what I want because I want it prayer. She wants to serve God in her desires. What can we learn from her about prayer? Do we want what we want for ourselves? Or do we pray to build God's kingdom, even if it's at our own expense? Let's go on to verse 17. Then Eli answered and said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant thee thy petition that thou hast asked of him. And she said, Let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. So the woman went her way, and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. What marvelous faith! I get the sense that the Spirit confirmed to her that what Eli said was the word of God. She didn't know how it would come about, but the Spirit gave her peace that God had heard her, and that she had prayed according to God's will. So let's go on in verse 20. Wherefore it came to pass, when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived, that she bare a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, Because I have asked him of the Lord.
Now, in our reading so far, this style of wording implies that the saying afterward means something significant, corresponding to the name given, a word play. Samuel means heard of God, as it mentions in the Institute Manual. So Hannah calls her son heard of God because I have asked him of the Lord.
Right. Let's go on to verse 21. And the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer unto the Lord the yearly sacrifice, and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said unto her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord, and there abide forever. And Elkanah her husband said unto her, Do what seemeth thee good. Tarry until thou have weaned him. Only the Lord establish his word. So the woman abode, and gave her son suck, until she weaned him. As a side note, it's customary in the East to nurse children for 3 years or longer. This information comes from the Anchor Bible Dictionary under Women, but also, you might find this interesting, in the Apocrypha, the book of 2 Maccabees, chapter 7, verse 27, also indicates that 3 years is a common time for weaning your child. And if you're asking, well, what in the world is the Apocrypha? Again, check out our video on how we got the Bible.
Right.
Now, I know we've pitched this a couple of times already here just recently, but if you haven't watched the video on how we got the Bible, John and I would agree it's the best thing we've ever made.
Absolutely.
Yeah, check it out. It's wonderful to get to know the history of this book that we love so much. Let's go on to verse 24. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, with 3 bullocks, and 1 ephah of flour, and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young, and they slew a bullock, and brought the child to Eli. And she said, O my Lord, as thy soul liveth, my Lord, I am the woman that stood by thee here, praying unto the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord hath given me my petition, which I asked of him. Therefore also I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord there. Wow.
And that brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 2. In the first 10 verses, we read a prayer in which Hannah praised the Lord for all he had done for her. She also testified of Jehovah's, Jesus Christ's, power and mercy. Hannah's prayer displays her great faith, knowledge of the gospel, and love for God. There's a particularly interesting phrase she gives in verse 10. The Lord shall judge the ends of the earth, and he shall give strength unto his king, and exalt the horn of his anointed. The term his anointed is from the Hebrew word Messiah, or as footnote 10b tells us, when this was translated into Greek for the Septuagint, the word used was Christos. So we may read this as, he shall give strength unto his king and exalt the horn or power of his Christ. It would seem that Hannah was blessed with the gift of prophecy in this prayer.
That's really cool. Hey, John, you mentioned the Septuagint there. Where can I go to find out a little bit more about what the Septuagint is?
If only we had a video. Oh, wait, we do. It's called How We Got the Bible.
You should really check it out. All right, let's jump ahead to see how Hannah and Elkanah honored God and how he honored them. Starting in verse 18. But Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him from year to year, when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And Eli blessed Elkanah and his wife, and said, The Lord give thee seed of this woman for the loan which is lent to the Lord. And they went unto their own home. And the Lord visited Hannah, so that she conceived and bare 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the child Samuel grew before the Lord. What a great blessing.
Yep. And clearly, while Samuel was a blessing in and of himself, the Lord opened Hannah's womb, and she had 5 other children.
So beautiful.
Now, in contrast, let's take a look at Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas.
Do we have to?
Yeah, I'm afraid we do.
Oh.
Verse 12. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord.
Iniquitous sluggards. Unfortunately, they served in the temple.
That's right. And in the next few verses, it describes how these 2 sons brought disrespect to the tabernacle. Eli's sons sinned by taking meat from the animal sacrifices that did not belong to them, and sometimes by force. By doing so, they were essentially robbing God of offerings and cheating the people. As it says in verse 17, Wherefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord.
What is the power of a bad example in the church? This would be an example of taking or carrying the Lord's name in vain.
And can you imagine the problem here? They're discouraging people. They're making people not want to give offerings to the Lord.
Yep, and it gets worse.
Right.
In verse 22, Now Eli was very old, and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel, and how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And he said unto them, Why do ye such things? For I hear your evil dealings by all this people. Nay, my sons, for it is no good report that I hear. Ye make the Lord's people to transgress.
So it's not bad enough that they're taking meat that they shouldn't, but they are also seducing women at the temple.
Yeah, in their role as temple priests. Think of like the wicked priests of King Noah in the Book of Mormon, or Alma the Younger's son Corianton going after a harlot while serving as a missionary. Doing evil while lifting up God's name, God will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain.
And in spite of Eli's efforts to counsel his sons, verse 25 tells us, Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto the voice of their father. Verse 27, And there came a man of God unto Eli, and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Did I plainly appear unto the house of thy father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? And did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon mine altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? And did I give unto the house of thy father all the offerings made by fire of the children of Israel? Wherefore kick ye at my sacrifice and at mine offering, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honorest thy sons above me, to make yourselves fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel my people? So Eli failed in his parental responsibility and in his office as the presiding priest. Although he rebuked his sons, he took no action to see that the abomination in his family and at the tabernacle was corrected. It's a powerful thought to realize that when we resist disciplining or correcting our children, particularly when they're rebelling against God, that we're honoring our children above God.
In the next few verses, the man who visited Eli pronounced the Lord's curse upon Eli and his house. Eli's household would be destroyed, and his posterity would not live to old age. His sons would die on the same day, and the Lord would give the priest's duties of the tabernacle to a more faithful man. Remember what we read at the beginning of the lesson, in verse 30. For them that honor me, I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. We saw a beautiful example of the first part of that verse in the story of Hannah, and the unfortunate illustration of the second part with Eli's family. And that brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 3. In verse 1, And the child Samuel ministered unto the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was precious, meaning scarce or rare, in those days. There was no open vision.
And why was the word of the Lord precious? Did he not have something to say? Or was it more that the people had not prepared their hearts to listen? Well, at least one person did. Let's read on. Verse 2. And it came to pass at that time, when Eli was laid down in his place, and his eyes began to wax dim, that he could not see. And ere the lamp of God went out in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and Samuel was laid down to sleep, that the Lord called Samuel. And he answered, Here am I. And he ran unto Eli, and said, Here am I, for thou callest me. And he said, I called not. Lie down again. And he went and lay down. And the Lord called yet again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli, and said, Here am I, for thou didst call me. And he answered, I called not, my son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, neither was the word of the Lord yet revealed unto him. And the Lord called Samuel again the third time. And he arose and went to Eli, and said, Here am I, for thou didst call me. And Eli perceived that the Lord had called the child. Therefore Eli said unto Samuel, Go, lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, that thou shalt say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. So Samuel went and laid down in his place. And the Lord came and stood, and called as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel answered, Speak, for thy servant heareth. And the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I will do a thing in Israel, at which both the ears of every one that heareth it shall tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all things which I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. And therefore I have sworn unto the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice nor offering forever.
The Lord was displeased with Eli for allowing the iniquity of his household to continue without correction. The Lord was also giving Samuel guidance and instruction in preparing for his calling as a prophet. Now, just a note before we go on. Understand that this condemnation of Eli's household is specifically for Eli's situation. We all have kids that don't live up to our expectations or that are in a process of becoming. Our job is to give them proper correction as they're growing up and give them guidance by teaching the gospel. But in this situation, the reason that Eli is given such a harsh punishment by the Lord has a lot to do with him not listening to the Lord's commands, honoring his sons more than the Lord, and the impact these sons are having on the people of Israel and their relationship with God. So let's go on with Samuel. What do we learn from Samuel's experience about recognizing the Lord's voice? There's a quote from Elder Boyd K. Packer in a January Ensign article from 1983. He says this, "The Spirit does not get our attention by shouting or shaking us with a heavy hand. Rather, it whispers, it caresses so gently that if we are preoccupied, we may not feel it at all. Occasionally, it will press just firmly enough for us to pay heed. But most of the time, if we do not heed the gentle feeling, the Spirit will withdraw and wait until we come seeking and listening."
That's from the article, The Candle of the Lord. We've quoted that one a lot.
It's a great one.
Yeah, it would be great to read the whole thing. There's another quote that we wanted to include, too, from the April 2009 General Conference from Elder Alan F. Packer. He says, quote, "We need to be acquainted with the promptings of the Holy Ghost, and we need to practice and apply gospel teachings until they become natural and automatic. These promptings become the foundation of our testimonies," end quote. And if you hadn't noticed the familiar last name, Alan F. Packer is Elder Boyd K. Packer's son.
Yeah, very cool. Well, let's take a look at verse 15. "And Samuel lay down until the morning, and opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And Samuel feared to show Eli the vision. Then Eli called Samuel, and said, Samuel, my son. And he answered, Here am I. And he said, What is the thing that the Lord hath said unto thee? I pray thee, hide it not from me. God do so to thee, and more also, if thou hide anything from me of all the things that he said unto thee. And Samuel told him every whit, and hid nothing from him. And he said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seemeth him good."
This had to be really hard for Eli to hear, but it also didn't seem unexpected.
No.
It seems clear that Eli is aware of the choices that he's made and the consequences of those choices.
Right.
Verse 19, "And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan even to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established to be a prophet of the Lord." Now there's a phrase that shows up a few times in the Old Testament, from Dan even to Beersheba. This is a colloquial way of saying all Israel. Dan is a city at the northernmost border of Israel. Likewise, Beersheba is a city in the southernmost border of Israel. It's kind of like someone today from the United States saying something like, all across America from New York to L.A. They're not literally talking about a specific strip of land between those two cities. It's a figurative way of starting from a point on the east and going to a far point on the west to describe the expanse of land. In this case, it's from the north to the south, Dan even to Beersheba.
Nice. And let's take a look at our last verse 21. "And the Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord."
Wonderful.
And so the prophetic calling of Samuel begins, and all that he's going to do to bless Israel is a result of the willingness of his mother Hannah to pray for him and give him up to the Lord. That sacrifice that she made blessed the whole nation of Israel. Wonderful.
It's all about the desires of our hearts, right?
Yep.
Well, what a wonderful lesson. What great examples we saw in Ruth and in Samuel and Hannah. I hope you've taken some time to examine these stories and look for gems that you can take and share.
And what great notions we have with this idea of benevolence beyond what's anticipated or expected. That chesed, and how we've seen that play out, and what a blessing it is to the people who have that virtue and have sought that virtue from the Lord.
Keep reading your scriptures, and we'll look forward to talking to you more about them in our next lesson.
We'll see you then.
This podcast is not officially affiliated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
But we're really big fans.